Hello and welcome to the Sprint 194 review. This was a normal 2-week sprint that ended last week. And we're doing the review today, a week after due to some vacations from the team. I'll start with the overview. UI will be done by Melody. Adam will do the providers, Joe on the platform, and then Keenan on the API. As you can see, Sprint 194 was a normal sprint with 117 PRs open and 91 PRs merged. And similar to the last sprint, we had 28 bug fixes, 15 enhancements. We're going to continue doing more bug fixes now that we've branched the Oparin branch, and we're going to stabilize that a bit before we start adding some new features. And over to Melody.
Yeah, good morning. So in this sprint, 14 PRs got merged into the UI Classic repo, out of which 7 were bugs, 3 were enhancements, and 4 were technical debt. And I can explain about them more in the following slides. So for this one, the dual list select buttons component was being overridden by the rest of the component. So David had modified the CSS so that those buttons would no longer be overridden. Here, the add new action page was hanging because it was mishandling some undefined values. So I implemented some checks so that those undefined values wouldn't break the page. Here, for this one, the dashboard tables would overflow when the page was scaled down. So Jeffrey fixed this by adding some additional CSS properties to the tables. Here, there was some additional padding for images in the summary pages, which were fixed when Jeffrey added some additional CSS properties. Here, the column format dropdown was using its label as its value, which caused this error. So I fixed it so that it would use its actual value rather than the label it had. Here, Gilbert fixed an issue where the provider form was rendering a password field instead of a text area box field. Here, while typing into the search bar in storage volumes, type error notifications were being displayed. So the Auto SDE team fixed this bug by setting skip JSON parsing true in the post request along with a string check for non-API URLs. For this one, I edited the items string to be either plural or singular, depending on the amount of items within a table. For this one, the Auto SDE modified the IQN component in host initiator form to support multiple IQNs to be added at once, as it is with the WWPN component. The change will also be reflected in the Auto SDE provider repo. The IQN details will now be passed as an array, not as a text field, so that when you select ISCSI as the port type, this will appear as in screenshot 1, but you can add to the display a new row and you can remove them by clicking the remove button as displayed in screenshot 2. For this one, the storage resource information was added under the relationship section with its respective links. As for the other PRs that we've had, Keenan removed a comment referencing availability mixin. Joe removed some old translation files. Joe also fixed a spec test related to schedules. And Joe also fixed a wrong number of arguments error in the Jasmine specs. And that's all from the UI side.
All right, so for providers this sprint, in the inventory refresh gem, we added Ruby 3 compliant arguments for lazy find, which is one of the primary methods that was causing us some problems in moving a lot of the provider refresh code to use Ruby 3.0. We also added some compatibility to that method where we handled 2 hash arguments, which was a way that it was being called and was working with 2.7, but stopped working in 3.0. So we'll have some compatibility before we migrate off of this and deprecate that calling convention completely. For AutoSDE this sprint, they added support for passing multiple IQNs when you create a host initiator. So the UI dropdown allows you to specify multiples, and then the backend provider code will parse that array and pass it over to the API properly. For Azure, we fixed an issue where we're using a direct find to get some information during the refresh. This is easily replaced by using a lazy find with a key, which essentially evaluates it during save and prevents any issues with ordering dependencies. This is going to be deprecated in upcoming inventory refresh versions as well, since using find directly is not going to be supported and is highly not recommended. Next slide. For Power VS this sprint, Jay added affinity controls to Power VS when you're creating a cloud volume. This allows you to specify if you want the volume to be running concurrently with other cloud volumes, or you want to specify anti-affinity if you want to make sure it's on a different storage system. And just really increases the compatibility with some of the more advanced features of Power VS. He also consolidated and renamed some of the provisioning dialogues. There was some duplication where a new dialog was created instead of updating an old one, and so he was able to delete that one. We also fixed another instance of find where it was easily replaceable with a lazy find in the Power VS refresh. And Keenan fixed one of the latter remaining validate delete images to get that off, so we can replace availability mixin with supports. For Power HMC, they fixed provisioning for VM and template after a request type fix was made. Essentially, when you were cloning a template to a VM and vice versa, the request type wasn't accurately reflecting what was being done. And so that was fixed last sprint, but they were depending on the essentially incorrect value in HMC. And so that required a fix to use the new correct one. And for Power VC, Jay fixed some inventory subclasses. Since the provider is inheriting from OpenStack, some of the classes were being set to be OpenStack as opposed to Power VC. So he fixed that in the refresh and also submitted a data migration to fix up any existing records. Next slide. For Kubernetes and OpenShift, they were using an older method, which was called lazy find by. This has been for a few years now, actually, replaced with lazy find. It was just code that was still working and easy to swap it over so that we can delete some of those old methods from the API and inventory refresh. This is an exciting one. So Nasser and OpenStack added a rake task, which sets up automatically a VCR environment using a microstack so that anybody can make changes and re-record the VCRs for OpenStack. Previously, we had some predefined environments which were set up with all the expected inventory to be able to run the tests on OpenStack, but these have long since been deleted and nobody has access to them anymore. And so it's nice to have a reproducible environment that anybody that can deploy a microstack VM is able to re-record the spec tests. So it's a nice, really nice enhancement for developers there. And lastly, for VMware, we moved the VNC ports entry over to an endpoint tab. For VMware, if you want to connect to a VM's console using VNC, which is an older style of doing it, but some people still require it, you had to give a port range explicitly when you added the provider. This is pretty confusing because it looked like it was required when it's actually optional. So we moved those out to an endpoint tab, so it's more obvious that it's optionally enabled. And that is it for providers. Finally, over to Joe.
Okay, for core enhancements, Keenan and I upgraded ManageIQ to Rails 6.1, and Jason joined the party on some follow-up fixes that always come with a Rails major version change. Next, Brandon updated the operator dependencies. As a follow-up, he also automated creating pull requests to update the operator dependencies in the future. Then Jason improved the container env loading time by checking for the presence of certificates before calling update CA trust. Jason also added a diagnostic for embedded Ansible to convert the very human unfriendly JSON standard out into a human readable format. Brandon added a default deny network policy to the operator pod. Jason also set extensible defaults for the database URL and the container env script. And he also optimized it to do the slow URL escaping only once instead of twice. Finally, Keenan removed a no longer used availability mix in shim that was used for backward compatibility while we were migrating to the supports feature mixing. Next slide. For core bugs, Jason and Adam had several fixes to get Ansible playbooks running on Morphe. Next, Jason and Brandon had many fixes and cleanup in the build area for appliances and Codified. Next, Adam fixed an issue where the script that checked that the database was ready was only reading the database YAML once and not picking up changes to the file later on. Then Keenan fixed an issue where our supports call included strings needing translations, but they were using the getText format that evaluates it eagerly, so it wasn't being called, for example, if you change your locale later on, so it's only translating once. So he changed that. Next slide. For the API, Keenan also fixed an issue we needed for Rails 6.1, where I believe we were using Arel attribute and that was no longer supported in 6.1. So we had to change it to Arel table. That was a backward incompatible change. So we had to kind of merge it as we went to Rails 6.1. Next slide.
All right, and that's it for our Sprint 194 review. The next Sprint 195 review will be on September 7th, and hopefully at the normal meeting time of 9:30 a.m. on that Wednesday. And I'd like to thank everybody who presented today. I'd like to thank all the contributors this past sprint, and also thanks to the community members who've been trying out the release and finding bugs and opening issues. We really appreciate that. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.